Good evening and welcome to our continuing series on the Siddur, on the daily liturgy, the morning davening, the beginning of which is called Birchos HaShachar, the morning blessings. The morning blessings are preliminary to the actual Shachar's prayer, and as such they represent the warming us up for real prayer. It's a warm-up thing. We begin, as we discussed in past classes, with a Moda Ani, where we express our gratitude for being alive, and then we go on to thank God for the various physical changes that occur after awakening. And we already went through several of these, and the last one we did was the one in which we thank God for giving us kayach, giving us the strength, the weary souls that we are when we go to bed, and we wake up in the morning invigorated and rejuvenated. And we also explained that on a spiritual level, there were some people who could find themselves vulnerable because of their spiritual weaknesses and the lack of resistance to the negative influences in this world. And they need the koach, they need the strength to be able to withstand all of the pressures and to meet all the challenges. And after that blessing comes the next one that reads as follows. Traditional beginning, the opening, Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed are you, God, Elokeinu, our God. God is the transcendent God, but he's also our God. Melech HaOlam, he's also the king of the whole world, not just ours. And then we go on to state the specific blessing, the specific praise of God. Roka ha'aretz al hamayim, who spreads out the earth above the waters. What is this blessing all about? So without going any further, just taking what we said thus far, that the blessing that preceded this one is asking God for the strength, physical strength, as well as emotional and spiritual strength. And then we're still in bed. We're ready to leave our own comfort zone, our own bed, our own place of refuge, where we're entirely into ourselves. There's no interaction with anyone when we're in bed. We're asleep, and we've just awakened, and we're still into ourselves, or to use the term that's used in the Talmud, neshama bi'apo, quoting a biblical verse, that our soul is still in our nostrils. We're still novices, spiritual and intellectual and emotional novices. We haven't yet challenged the outside world. The first step we take, we put our feet on the ground. We must see to it that the ground is terra firma, as the Latin word for earth is terra firma, solid ground. We need solid ground. And this is the blessing which quite literally thanks God for giving us earth upon the water. And with all the other deeper levels, it means literally that we can walk outside or out of our bed and put our feet on the ground. This exact expression, that God spreads out the earth above the waters, has a much earlier source. It's in the book of Psalms, Psalm 136, verse 6. That psalm is called Hallel Hagadol, the great Hallel, because it includes 26 praises of God. 26 is the equivalent of God's name. The Tetragrammaton adds up to 26, so there's one praise for each of the numerical aspects of God's name. And the sixth verse is the one in which we say, L'roka ha'aretz al hamayim, to the one who spreads out the earth over the water. And then we add a few more words which are not in this blessing. Ki li'olam chasto, for his kindness is forever. So this blessing was modeled after the biblical verse uttered by King David in praise of God. What exactly are we thanking God for? Let's take this a little bit more slowly and go step by step. So the commentators, I believe the first one who explains it is the famous commentator of the Jewish prayer book known as the Avudraham. He lived about 600 years ago. And he writes that by nature, earth is heavier than water, so the earth should be sinking into the water, and instead God makes sure that the earth should be above the water. Others look at the sequence of events in creation. Before God established the earth, it says the entire earth was inundated with water. And then God, on day 3, said, Yukavu hamayim, that the waters gather, same root as the word mikveh, a gathering of waters in one place, the oceans, v'seira'eh hayabasha, and the dry land shall be visible. So that was one act of creation, and by the way, God said kitov, it was good. And as Rashi explains, it was the culmination of what happened on day 2, when that separation didn't yet exist. So day 3 is a correction of day 2. Now this has deeper meaning, and it extends beyond the simple, because we know that day 2 and day 3 parallel the second millennium and the third millennium of existence. In the second millennium there was chaos. The third millennium, the Torah was given, in which the fusion and the synthesis between heaven and earth occurred. And it was a time of peace and tranquility. Well, that's reflected and symbolized by the fact that there's now a separation between the waters and the earth, the waters and the dry land, and the dry land stands independently of the waters. And that is the great miracle of creation that we're grateful to God for on a daily basis. The Ikarim, one of the great Jewish philosophers who deals with the principles of faith and who maintains that one of the fundamental principles of faith, although he disagrees with Maimonides who says there are 13, he reduces them to 3, but one of them is to know that God is in charge of this world. So he says that the fact that earth is over the water goes contrary to the natural tendency for earth to sink. So this is proof of God's providence. This is where we see God's providence. When you look at a sunrise, obviously it's God who's creating the sun and the earth and all the other aspects of nature, but where do you see something that seems to be going against nature, within nature? That's the fact that the earth is above the water. So according to the Ikarim, this blessing is a manifestation of God's providence. And if you just look around the world, if we need reminders of the miracle of the earth being above the waters, just look at the floods, tidal waves, where hundreds of thousands of people could be swept away in a few minutes. Sinkholes, where the earth crumbles and the water takes over, and so many areas in this country as well as throughout the world where rivers overflow after the melting snows and so on and so forth. We could really appreciate this blessing when we look at the devastation that is caused by this blessing being reversed. And that's why the psalm in which King David extols the greatness of God by keeping the earth over the waters, he concludes with the words, Ki li'olam chasta, for his kindness is forever. Because although God's kindness is constant in every area of life, where do you see this on a constant, continuous basis every second that the earth doesn't crumble and, God forbid, swallow us, as in the earthquakes that we just witnessed in Nepal? That is a constant testimony to God's kindness for us. And as the Rebbe explains, that is why we add those words, for his kindness is forever, because you need perpetual kindness. Sometimes you give someone a gift, you give them a donation, they use it for whatever they need. You don't have to be involved constantly, but this is one area where you can see God's constant involvement. And I'd just like to add that the truth is that God is continuously creating the whole universe. Every second, the entire universe is being recreated. But you don't see the recreation of the universe because this seems to be a continuum, seems to be a flow, that one instant is connected to the one before. You don't realize that it's being recreated every instant. But where do you realize it? When you look at something that defies, as it were, nature itself. The earth isn't crumbling. The waters aren't taking over. And therefore, that reminds us of the fact that God is continuously creating the world, and it's true about every aspect of creation. So every now and then we have one area in life which alerts us to the reality of every aspect of life. One of the commentators, Rabbi Gutmacher, says a very interesting thing about a story that is recorded in the Talmud when Titus, the Roman emperor, first general, then emperor, destroyed the temple, and he was very proud of himself, and he traveled back to Rome by sea, and there was a raging storm, and he says, "Oh, the God of Israel, your power is only in the water. That's where you drowned the Egyptians. On earth, on terra firma, you're not in control," which is what Titus, the Roman general, said, and then God showed him how he was in control on earth. A little gnat or mosquito entered his nostrils and bored into his brain. That's a whole long story till he died in great pain. Wasn't Titus a little bit more sophisticated than that to recognize that God, if he has power over the sea, he has power over the land? So Rabbi Gutmacher explains it in a very novel, a very interesting way. There's a philosophy, I should say, that God created the world. Yes, they believe in creation, but Ozav Hashem Esaretz, God withdrew. He just started the world going. He turned the switch on, and the world goes on its own, and he's no longer involved, and he no longer has the power, whether he doesn't have the power or he relinquished his power for whatever reason, but he is not in control of the world. The world goes on its own. That was a belief that many have had, and it's alluded to in the book of Psalms as a heretical belief. So Titus felt, you know what, this God, where do we find him still being in control? In the waters. Keeping the waters from inundating the earth, that is a perpetual thing, because if he leaves go, if one leaves go of that for one instant, the entire world will be covered with the waters of the oceans, and we will cease to exist. So when he sees God causing this raging storm, he says, "Oh God, I know you're in control of the waters. That's the one area you didn't relinquish control. But the earth is different. There I don't see your providence. I don't see how you are in control." And what does God do? He takes the least significant of creatures, a little gnat, mosquito, or whatever the insect was, a little nothing, the lowliest of creatures. He says, "I'm even in control of that." And that's what brought him to his demise. Let's go to a deeper understanding of this blessing. The simple meaning, as we just said, is that physically, God causes the earth to stand above, be spread over the waters. And therefore, we're grateful for this continuous miracle that keeps us alive. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, who also authored many other books, one of them is the Torah Or. And this exposition is found there, as well as in his grandson's colossal, multi-voluminous work, about 40-volume work, called Or HaTorah. And he says that in Hasidic literature, in Kabbalah, earth and water are symbols. They're representative of two different dimensions of existence. In Kabbalah, we're taught that there are two dimensions. One is called Alma de Iskasia, that's Aramaic for the concealed world, and Alma de Isgalia, and the revealed worlds. What is the difference between the two? The worlds that are concealed, like the ocean, in which everything that exists is completely covered up, submerged in the ocean. Not only is it submerged, but every creature of the ocean derives its sustenance and its nourishment from the ocean, to such an extent that if a fish would leave the ocean for an extended period, it couldn't exist. It couldn't survive. Which refers to a spiritual, it's a metaphor for a spiritual state of existence where everything is covered up by divine energy to such an extent that it doesn't have the ability to look at itself as having an independent existence. It is just totally godly. That is the world that is known as Alma de Iskasia, the world of concealment. And then there's Alma de Isgalia, the revealed world. that is our world, and even other spiritual dimensions, because you can be spiritual and yet not be submerged in the divine. You can still have your independent identity, though you may feel a need to do something for that which is above you and beyond you, and you recognize that where your sustenance comes from, just like we recognize that we get our nourishment from the earth. All food comes from the earth. Even animals are nurtured from the earth. So whatever we eat, we get it from the earth. So an earthly metaphor means a world in which everything that is in our existence is exposed, is revealed. There is no, we're not covered up by anything. We're not concealed. Those are the two worlds. The earth represents the revealed world. The ocean, the water, represents the concealed world. Now, obviously, the concealed world are much higher than the revealed worlds. Spirituality is higher than physicality, or a lower level of spirituality. That's the way it was initially. Initially, when God created us, first He created a spiritual existence, a spiritual identity, and then He created a lowly and lower physical existence. That's how it was up until day 3. Up until day 3 of creation, when the earth was covered with waters. What did that mean? That meant that the potential for non-existence, non-independent existence, was the reality of that day. On day 3, where He separated the water from the earth, and the earth is above the water, in that day, He reoriented creation to the point where preeminence is given to the physical over the spiritual. This is a revolutionary idea, one of the very revolutionary ideas that are rooted in Kabbalah but are explained in Hasidic literature. What does that mean? That means that where is God's real interest? What is God's ultimate objective? Not the spiritual realms, not the hidden worlds, not the spiritual oceans, but the earth, terra firma, the physical existence that we inhabit, where we are independent beings, and we do not feel this being submerged in the ocean of divine light and divine energy. We have our own independence, we have an Yetzer Hara, an evil impulse, we have the struggles, and we live our lives physically in accordance with God's will by performing the physical acts of mitzvahs. So this is what we say after we go through the blessing. God, you clothe the naked. You give us who are spiritually naked, you give us the clothing that we need to protect ourselves. God, nosin layav koach, which is the next blessing. You give the weary, even those who can't just get away with it, with just clothing. You need to give us strength. But there are some people who don't have the strength and don't have the clothing. But God says, if you don't have the spiritual energy, if you don't have the stamina that comes from a spiritual consciousness, just do physical, practical things. And it doesn't just mean that if you're not spiritual, do physical things. It also means that even if you're very spiritual, but if you really want to connect to God, you do a mitzvah. The earth is where it's at. When God created the world, His purpose was not the worlds of spirituality, known as the world of Atzilus, the world of emanation, the world of creation, of formation, and the spiritual world of action, the 4 worlds. Those 4 worlds are broken up into the hidden and the revealed. He wants our life down here in the physical existence. Conversely, we could explain this blessing in a little bit of a different way, based on other sources in Chassidus. Earth, the Talmud says, the word earth is eretz. Actually, the English word earth is most likely a derivation of the Hebrew word, which is eretz. What does the word eretz mean? We translate it as earth or land. But the etymology of the word is two words, ratzon, will, and rutz, running. And the Talmud and Midrash explain that the word earth means the desire to fulfill God's will. That's what earth is. Earth is the embodiment of God's will. And water is sometimes viewed, in the earlier metaphor, it was viewed as a spiritual existence, the hidden world, the world in which we're submerged in divinity. But water is also seen as the source of sybaritic pleasures, of temptation, of hedonistic tendencies, desires for fulfilling one's physical and material temptations. And we have a struggle. And we thank God, God, you spread the earth over the waters. You give us the ability to follow your will and to cover up and to suppress the desires that we have that are inconsistent with your will. Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, says this in very kernel form, and it's further developed by the Sfas Emes, one of the Gera Hasidic masters, known as the Gera Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter. He says water is a metaphor also for kindness. Fire is a metaphor for harshness, judgment. God has an attribute of kindness and he has an attribute of justice. But of course, which do we prefer? We prefer God's kindness, and God also prefers it. Kindness is something that is needed all the time. Without God's kindness, there's no basis for existence. Judgment is sporadic. God will allow people to get away with it for a while, hoping that we do tshuva, we repent, and sometimes the suffering and pain that we endure cleanses us, so that his judgment is not necessarily there all the time, either by design or by virtue of the fact that we don't deserve God's judgment. But kindness we always deserve and we always need. He also explains that's why fire goes up. It's a tendency. It doesn't want to be part of this world. Fire doesn't fit in this world. It tries to escape this world. Water, on the other hand, always flows downward. Water wants this world. It wants to nurture. So the water personality is the nurturing personality. The fire personality is the one who wants to withdraw from society in whichever situation it can be applied. So what are we saying when we praise God that he spreads the earth over the water? The Sfas Emes says, we express our gratitude to God that the world, earth, the world, is spread out over the principle of water. That earth, that our existence is primarily governed by God's attribute of kindness. Reb Chaim Pelagi, one of the great Sephardic masters, goes back to the flood. The flood was actually a reversal of the reversal, because in the beginning of creation, the water flooded the whole world. And then on day 3, God separates between the two. So what does the flood mean? That because of people's sins, there was a reversal of the reversal, and God allowed the water to inundate the world and destroy it. And therefore, he says that all negative energy, illness, for example, started with the flood. The flood undermined the stability and the healthy nature of the world in which we live. And when we talk about healing, healing is where the earth goes back to existing over the waters. It's interesting, in the book of Ecclesiastes, there are 28 statements. There's a time for this and a time for that. And he shows how it parallels 28 items, among them the 26 things for which King David praises God for his kindness. And the one about the earth over the waters parallels the one that says there's a time to heal. That the earth over the waters is the metaphor for healing. The Alshich, Ramosha Alshich, was a contemporary of the Ari, the great Kabbalist who lived about 450 years ago, quotes the words of our sages that when a wicked person steps on the earth trembles. The earth is very nervous, becomes very agitated. Why? Because the earth is forced to go against the nature of it to go down and for water to inundate it and to cover it. The earth is doing everything it has to do to conform to God's will to stay above water. And here's someone walking on me, the earth says, that is going against God's will. So it undermines, and a person goes against God's will, it undermines the stability of creation itself. On a deeper, more Kabbalistic level, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, in his classic work called Derech Mitzvosecha, where he explains the various biblical commandments on a deep mystical level, he explains that water is also a metaphor for the world of Tohu, the world of chaos. Tohu was a world where there's tremendous spiritual energy, but there's no instrument that could contain it, and the instrument is shattered. It's like getting a short when you put a plug into the outlet and there's too much energy for the equipment and it just shorts the equipment. Well, that's what happened on a spiritual level in the world of Tohu, where God's energy just shattered the instruments. Well, what does that mean in terms of our spiritual lives? Sometimes a person becomes very passionate about God, very passionate about Judaism. They're full of love and passion and excitement and enthusiasm and devotion. And what happens is that because they don't have the vessels, they don't have the right instruments to internalize it, to make it compatible with our systems, what happens is it shatters the person, and the passion doesn't leave, but it's diverted into the wrong area. The person, instead of loving God and loving one's fellow and loving to do spiritual and godly things, starts to love material things and other forms of love, taking license, which is criminal, because they have this uncontrollable passion that was first directed in a positive area, in a positive fashion, but nevertheless it didn't work because it was too powerful. So this is what we mean, that we need the earth to refine the water, to refine the passion. The person, even when they're in their highest form of passion for God, have to let the water go beneath the earth. They have to suppress it and let the water be filtered through the earth. And then the water that comes out becomes refreshing water, purified water. And in terms of our emotions, the passion is internalized, and it's not going to be a destructive form of passion. There's a midrash that says that when God separated the heavenly waters from the earthly waters cried, and they said, "We want to be in the God's presence. Why should we be down here on earth?" And God says, "You will be in my presence in a different way. You will be the source of purification. You will form the waters of the mikveh, the waters that we wash our hands before a meal, the waters that symbolize purity and holiness, even though you're down here on earth." So there's a certain element of craving to go higher. Some people like to escape reality, and they think that that's where truth is, that's where idealism is, that's where their soul craves to be, and that's true. But that's not what God craves for the soul. What God craves for the soul is that the waters come down and they go beneath the earth, and that we have to dig into the earth to find these refreshing waters that are the purifying waters. So we thank God that God allowed us to have the earth cover the waters and that preserve the purifying aspect of these waters, and not let the waters return to their source and deprive us of that ability. So it's the earth that keeps the waters in place and doesn't let them, spiritually speaking, of withdrawing and returning back to their source. In the writings of more Musar-oriented writings, we have a different interpretation of this blessing. Water is a metaphor for so many different things, but the one thing that water is used as a metaphor for is Torah itself. In the book of Isaiah, it says, if you're thirsty, go to learn Torah. Torah is the source of quenching our spiritual thirst. If your soul is parched with thirst, it wants to study Torah. The story is told of Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev. When he was old and frail and not well, and he fasted Yom Kippur, and his family was very concerned about his health. As soon as the fast was over, he cried out, I am so thirsty. I'm famished. And immediately they thought his life was in danger. They ran to the kitchen and they brought him a cup of water, and they saw him studying the Talmud, the tractate Sukkah, the laws of the Sukkah. And they put the glass down. A half hour, an hour later, again he said, oh, I'm so thirsty. And they bring him another glass, and they see he hadn't touched the first one. And this repeated itself throughout the night. He hadn't broken the fast yet. And all night long he was studying the Talmud until early in the morning he finished the entire tractate. It's about 110 pages of detailed, intricate discussion. And they asked him, you were saying you're thirsty, and yet you didn't touch all the glasses of water we brought you. And his answer was, I wasn't thirsty for physical water. I was thirsty for Torah, because Yom Kippur is a day spent in prayer, and I was engaged in prayer the entire 24 hours, and I hadn't been given the opportunity, for good reason, to study Torah. So I was so thirsty to study Torah. And Torah, therefore, is likened to water. And if a person hadn't studied for a long time, it's like going in a desert and not having what to drink. So what we say over here is that God spreads the earth over the water, which means that the whole premise of the earth, the whole reason we are here on this earth, is to study the Torah, which is likened to water. It says in the Talmud that a person was created to toil. It's a verse in Job. But the Talmud discusses what kind of toil. It says, is it toil for work? It means we're here for physical labor. It's necessary, but that's our whole goal. And then it says, is it for the toil in speech? We're here to talk. Or is it the toil of Torah? And that's the ultimate goal. The ultimate preoccupation of a Jew is the toil of Torah study. Of course, if Torah study is not translated into action, it's not really Torah study, but that's a separate subject. So we put the earth, the whole earth is spread over the water. The water is the foundation and the raison d'etre of our whole existence on this earth, that we study Torah. So this blessing, in summary, is thanking God for the physical earth, that we're not inundated with water, we don't have floods. It's also thanking God for giving us the blessings of mitzvahs that we have, that is greater than even the spiritual world. We give thanks to God for giving us the power to overcome our temptations. We give thanks to God for the Torah, and so many other nuances that we've discussed today are all contained, and much more, I'm sure, if we delve more deeply into this, in this one little blessing that we recite every morning. So when we recite this blessing, we should realize that it's really a meaningful blessing in more than one way, and we should treat it accordingly. Have a good evening, and welcome you back next week for the continuation of the morning blessings.